Good morning. How are we doing this morning? Happy Father's Day to all you dads in the room. Genesis chapter 32 is where we're going to be this morning. Genesis chapter 32. My two oldest kids, they love going to the dentist. Any of your kids love going to the dentist? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. But my oldest loves the dentist. He thinks things like braces are really cool, and so he's really hoping that he gets to get braces. And I try to tell him, like, man, like, I had braces, I had headgear, like, I had everything you could possibly have going on inside your face and in your mouth. You don't want that. It's miserable. I think that he believes that having double braces would be really cool, like double layer. Like, he's really excited about one day that he might be able to have braces. But this week he started talking about the dentist. Here's the problem in my home. My oldest son loves going to the dentist. My youngest son hates the dentist, and he immediately started crying and freaking out, and he's traumatized because of past experience at the dentist, right? The past is no good to him right now because of what has happened with him at the dentist. Isn't it interesting? What is it in your past that you'd never want to face? When you think about your own life, what's in your past that you'd actually never want to face? What in your past would bring up maybe great pain? Isn't it interesting that past experiences can trigger all kinds of responses? Our question for the morning is this: what's your plan when you're faced with your past? Here's what I know. Of all the people in the room this morning, what typically can often happen in our life is that our past actually can rob us of today. That there might be decisions you've made in your past, right, that have robbed you of how you actually live in the moment. It could be pain, it could be distress, it could be a failure, some kind of sin that you've committed in your past that still causes you pain today. And so here's what we do. I think we often respond by believing this: if I can just go ahead and ignore that for as long as possible, then everything's actually going to work out. You see, we don't want to face the cost. We don't want to face the consequences maybe of those choices that we've actually made. But here's the truth. When God gets involved in your life, he's going to ask you at some point to face your past. He's going to ask you at some point to step right into the past, to look it in the face and say, let's deal with this together. I want to set the stage this morning before we jump into the story of Jacob again. I want us to look through a lens of Galatians chapter 6-7, which says this: do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. So question for you: when you see this verse for the first time probably in a while in your life, does this verse discourage you or does it encourage you? Are you encouraged or discouraged? Let's just be honest, in a room of honesty. How many of us have prayed for crop failure before? Anyone? Only 4 of us? Okay. In a room of honesty, how many of us have prayed for crop failure before? Okay. 8 of us now. Here's the thing. We make mistakes, we make choices, we choose sin, we plant that, right? And then guess what's gonna happen? The harvest that's gonna be produced is gonna be based on what we actually planted in our life. And so praying for crop failure is this: God, I planted something I don't like. God, I planted something that's not gonna benefit me in the future. Can you somehow change the results of what I've actually planted in my own heart and in my own life? It's scary, isn't it? The only way that your past can actually change is if Jesus gets involved. But I know this: Jesus wants you to face your past. And we see that in the life of Jacob. Jacob was living with his uncle Laban for 20 years because he was on the run because he burned his family. He deceived his brother and he was afraid for his life. And so he's been on the run living with his uncle Laban for 20 years. And I'll just be honest with you, I would say that Jacob's been in prison. He was experiencing, really, over the last 20 years, the consequences of his own sin is what he was experiencing. It was all about the choices that he has made, the pain that he's actually caused, and so he is reaping what he had sown. And the truth of the matter is, his uncle Laban wasn't a great guy. He was a jerk. Right? And Laban actually took advantage of Jacob too. Laban actually deceived Jacob in many ways. It's almost like Laban was the prison guard and Jacob was the prisoner, and Laban was determining what Jacob will and will not do in his life. So here's what happens. God comes to Jacob and he says this, after 20 years of being really under this terrible relationship with his uncle, I want you to leave your uncle and I want you to go home. So here's the truth. Jacob would never leave Laban unless God intervened and said this, I want you to leave the prison of your uncle. I want to pack up your family and I want you to get out of there and I want you to go home. Now, why would Jacob find the courage to actually do that? The answer is because God promised to actually be with them, which we saw last week. God said, I will be with you till the end. And so we get this picture of Jacob breaking out of prison, him leaving his uncle, and Laban was out in the fields. He was shearing sheep, and he was a ways away. And so quietly, Jacob gets everyone in his family, and they leave. And then Laban hears about what happened, and Laban gathers his kinsmen together, and he pursues Jacob like a fugitive. He pursues them for 7 days. In fact, when he catches up to Jacob, he confessed this, I intended to do you harm. You see, all of a sudden we get this picture of Jacob being surrounded by Laban and Laban's men. By the way, this is Laban's own family. His own daughters are married to Jacob, his grandbabies. He's gonna do them all harm? This is the kind of guy that Laban actually is. But when they caught up, God intervened and told Laban, hey, don't touch Jacob, leave Jacob alone. And so they made a treaty, they made a covenant, and they created peace. And Laban went home, and Jacob started heading home with 4 wives, 11 children, and unbelievable amounts of wealth from the Lord. So what happens when Jacob is gonna face his past? And as we look at the lens of Jacob, I want you to think about what will happen when God asks you to actually face your past. We're gonna pick it up in Genesis chapter 32 this morning. Let's take a look at it. It says this in verse 1, Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's camp. So we called the name of that place Mahanaim. And Jacob sent messengers from before him to Esau's brother in land of Seir, the country of Edom, instructing them, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now. I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male servants and female servants. I have sent to tell my lord in order that I may find favor in your sight. And so here's what's happening. Jacob is heading back home, but to get home, he's got to go through Esau. He's got to go through his brother, this brother who he's offended in the greatest degree. But here's what's interesting in verse 1. What does it say? It says the angels of God met Jacob. Now here's the thing. This is not the first time Jacob has interacted with the angels of God. It happened 20 years prior. In Genesis 28, after he burned his brother and burned his family, he left them because his life was in danger. And it's in that first night that God appeared to him in a dream. You remember the ladder that the angels were going up and down that God appeared to Jacob in? You see, here's what's crazy. When God shows up in your life, oftentimes he shows up in significant ways. And that is exactly what's happening with Jacob. And so what did God tell Jacob in that dream? Check this out from 20 years prior, Genesis 28, verse 15. It says, God said, behold, I am with you, and I'll keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you. So think about this. Jacob is on the run because he's deceived his brother. No one wants to be friends with him. No one wants to marry this guy. This guy's a jerk, and this guy's a punk. And God is saying, no, I want you. I'm going to do what I want to do through you, and I'm going to get you home. God is incredible here. God is saying and making a promise to him, I'm going to complete my plan in your life. You're leaving now, and I'm going to get you back to come home at some point. Literally what God is doing is demonstrating his sovereignty over Jacob's life. It's as if God is saying this, hey, Jacob, the next 20 years of your life, you're going to be faced with your uncle Laban. It's going to be very painful for you. But here's the truth. I'm going to use your uncle Laban like a spiritual mirror in your life to show you exactly what you've done and who you are. But then I also want you to know that I'm going to change your life. I'm going to change you. I'm going to make you more dependent on me. You see, here's what God was saying. Hey, Jacob, it's time to face the consequences of your sin. But here's what I want you to know, Jacob. Before you go hang out for 20 years with your uncle, I want you to know the consequences of your sin are not going to define your life because I'm going to define who you are. Jacob goes, hangs out with his uncle, and God has been telling him in the very beginning, your past will not dictate your future. The rear view mirror, Jacob, is not going to win in your life because I, the Lord, am going to bring you back home. So endure. Endure. So God at this point is now rescued Jacob out of the hands of Laban. And in Genesis 32, the angels visit him a second time, a time to encourage him, a time to refresh him. And the angel's appearance is wild to me because if you think about it, in Genesis 28, 20 years prior, the angels appear. In Genesis 32, 20 years later, the angels appear, which means this, that his encounters with God bracketed his time in the wilderness, bracketed his time in prison with his uncle Laban. God was saying this, I was with you the whole time. And so we saw in verse 3 that Jacob, what did he do? He left his encounter with the angels. He's getting ready to face his brother. He hasn't seen him in 20 years. And here's what he does. He sends messengers ahead to Esau to get a little lay of the land, to figure out how Esau's actually doing, to figure out what is his frustration with him right now. Is he angry or is he cooled down? Is he still want to kill me? Does he still hate me? Or are we cool to try to figure something out here in this moment? It's interesting. What did he tell the servants to say to Esau? Hey, I want you to tell Esau that he's my Lord. And I want you to tell Esau that I'm his servant. I don't know about you, but in my home with my brother, we never talk to one another that way. Right? My brother never one time called me Lord. I never one time told my brother that I'm his servant. Does that work in your home that way? Are your kids that kind to one another? It's a weird story. You see, Jacob his whole life has only been concerned about being on top, but for some reason now he's willing to come in second place. He's not about winning at the expense of everyone at this point. He's willing to have a little bit of a heart of humility. What is Jacob's goal? Look at verse 5. Jacob's goal is this, the end of it, that I may find favor in your sight. In other words, Jacob is going to do whatever he has to do to create peace with his brother. Whatever he's got to do, he wants to do it. He knows that he's blown it with his brother. He's mistreated his brother. But I think we can make the observation, and maybe you're familiar with this, that shame is dictating his decision making. Ever experienced shame before? Do you realize that guilt and shame actually have a very unique relationship? But while they have a unique relationship, guilt and shame are actually still very different. What's guilt? Listen, guilt is tied to an event. Guilt is tied to an act. Guilt is the who, the what, the where, the when. Guilt says this, I did something wrong. Guilt says, look at the wound and the pain and the turmoil that I've actually caused by the decisions that I actually made. Guilt is feeling bad about what you did. But what is shame? Listen, shame is feeling bad about who you are. It's not just about what you did. You are what you did. Shame says, I am what I've actually done. And here's the thing, that the scar of shame doesn't really go away. And we give permission for shame to exist in our life and to define who we actually are. And so I wonder this morning, how many of us are carrying around heavy weights of guilt and shame in our life, and we're being held hostage by it? Do you know that shame has a source? And the source is who? It's Satan. Just let's call it what it is. If you have shame in your life, that exists because you've given it permission to exist in your life, and it's there because the source of that is actually Satan. And Satan has a plan. Satan has a goal. His goal is to discourage you in every single way possible, and his only weapon is deception. And so the goal of Satan is to get your focus off who Christ says that you actually are and get your focus on what he says that you are. You are what you've done. You are very guilty. Look at all these people you've hurt. And he wants you trapped to make decisions based on the shames. In other words, we could say this, that shame creates accusation in your life with the goal of robbing you of all that you are in Jesus. With the heartbeat of you living in the guilt of all that you've done. What do we do with guilt and shame, church? This is a real issue. If we're going to be honest, we all carry it. I think what we need to do is this. We need to speak gospel truth and gospel fact to our shame. Let me give you one verse as a reference. Romans chapter 8, verse 1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. I want you to focus on the timely word now. Father's Day, 2023, now. Not when you get to heaven, not when you're fully glorified in the presence of Christ. Right now, in this very moment, God is saying this: there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Now here's the thing. Guilt wants to condemn you now. Shame wants to condemn you now. But here's the thing. Shame is always connected to a lie. The lie is who? It's Satan. The other name for Satan is he's an accuser. Right? And he wants to pin you into a corner and for you just to live with the weight and the guilt and the shame of all that you've done, just the bad. He's not talking about the good that you've done, just the garbage that you've done. He wants that to hold you actually down. You see, here's the thing. But what God does is God actually trumps the message of shame. Here's what God says. In this very moment, you are not defined by what you've done. You are defined by what I've done. That's a different kind of message. You are not what you've done. Are you hearing me? You are who Christ says that you actually are. There's good news there. There's actual freedom there. And what does that mean? That means this. You can't stand before God fully righteous and condemned at the same time. It's actually impossible. And so Satan has a goal. Satan's goal is accusation. And here's what he wants to tell you. You are garbage to God. You're garbage. Yet Romans chapter 8, verse 1 says this. God is saying this. Listen, friends. You are royalty to me. You are royalty to me. And that's a different kind of message. And so God is fully behind Jacob. Here's the question. Why not just go face your brother? Why not just march your family right up to him and own what you did 20 years ago? Repent to your brother and say, I blew it, it was my fault. Will you forgive me for what I've done? Why should he do that? In my opinion, God has promised his presence. And I think God loves it when we put his promises on the line. If God makes a promise to you, we need to step into that promise. And sometimes it requires circumstances that hit the fan for us to step into that moment to say, God, you said you're gonna catch me in this moment. God, you promised to come through for me. I'm stepping into the moment. Does Jacob do that? Here's the tension for Jacob. And the tension is real. Do I want to try to control the outcome? Or do I want to trust that God is in control of the outcome? You see, here's what we see with this first point is that you control your outcome by scheming. And that's what we see Jacob actually doing in this moment. Listen, there's one part of my day when my kids are in school that I can't stand. Do you guys have parts of your schedule in your life that you just don't look forward to? Maybe it's just me. It's only a 10-minute window when my kids are in school, and it's after we put them to bed, and that 10-minute window is making lunches for the next day. I really do not like this 10-minute window at all. It's the worst part of my entire day, and it only takes 10 minutes, maybe 15 tops. It's really not that big of a deal, but I really do not like it. So what I want to do is try to scheme to get out of making lunches every night when we make it, and my wife doesn't allow it to happen. Right? No matter the excuses I give, she's like, no, you're going to be in the kitchen, and we're going to make these lunches together, right? And I really do not enjoy it at all. And so on the last day of school, when we make our last lunch the night before, I love to give my wife a high five. We did it. Another season. We get a break from the worst 10-minute period of our lives, making lunches for our kids. But then she realizes, wait a second, but now the kids are home every single day and I have to make lunch every single day. I'm like, you do. You do. You know, and I then just say this, you know, like I'm going to be at the office. I got to connect people to Jesus for life change. Like someone's got to do it. So might as well be me. Right? Scheming any way I can to get out of making lunches for that 10-minute period. Don't we all know what it's like to scheme? All of us are pro at it, to be honest. So the messengers return. Look at verse 6 through 8. The messengers return to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau and he's coming to meet you. Encouraging, right? There are 400 men with him. Uh-oh. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. He divided the people who were with him and the flocks and the herds and the camels into two camps, thinking if Esau comes to the one camp and attacks it, then the camp that is left will escape. And so I'm sure Jacob was anxious, right? He sent his servants off, tell Esau he's my Lord, tell Esau I'm his servant. I'm sure he's just pacing back and forth, right? Super nervous about the report back. What are they gonna say? I'm sure he's sweating. Here comes his messengers. Hey, Esau's coming to see you. Oh, wow, that's awesome. That's incredible. With 400 men. What do the verses say? Verse 7, that Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. Wait, what? 400 men? That's not a family. That's an army. That's a problem. And so what is Jacob's response? His response is to try to find a way to control the situation. His past is catching up to him. I'm going to divide my family in two parts. And if Esau takes out one, then the other part of my family will be able to get away. If you've been with us in the study of Jacob, we've seen this, that every single time Jacob schemes, it leaves a wake of broken relationships behind him. Why? Because every time we scheme to produce some kind of outcome, how that actually plays out in our life is significant. And what I mean by that is this: we scheme to serve ourselves. When we scheme, we're trying to control the outcome to serve me. It's actually not about other people at all. So no wonder it goes bad every single time we do it. You see, plan A is often our knee-jerk response of trying to gain control by doing something good. We want to control the outcome. What's your plan when you have to face your past? Here's the second, plan B, commit your outcome while surrendering. Take a look at verse 9 with me. It says, then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed the Jordan. Now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers and the children. But you said, I will surely do you good. Make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. In verse 9 through 12, what does Jacob do? He prays. By the way, we've seen his grandfather Abraham pray a lot. We've seen his own father Isaac pray. In fact, the reason Jacob exists and Esau exists is because their father Isaac prayed for 20 years that they may actually be able to have children. But for the first time in the Bible, Jacob is going to pray. Now, he might have prayed with his kids when he put them to bed, or he might have prayed at the dinner table, but this is the first recorded prayer of Jacob in his life, right here in a time of pleading with the Lord. Question: what is causing Jacob to be serious about prayer? What would cause you to be serious about prayer? The answer is crisis. When life hits the fan, and we can no longer control, we can no longer scheme the outcome, then and only then we'll fall on our face before the Lord and we'll plead, God, I need your help. God, I need you to come through for me. What's the crisis? He's got 400 men coming his way, and it's just him, his family, his kids, all his wealth. The tension, God, is you rescued me out of the hands of Laban. That's one guy. How are you going to do it with 400 men being led by my brother, who the last time I saw him wanted to actually kill me? It's been interesting to me to see that Jacob has described God as the God of Abraham. He's described God as the God of his own father, Isaac, but he's never been described as God is actually his God. Why is God not described as the God of Jacob yet in the Bible? We know he will be. He will be the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, but we're not there yet to the Jacob part. Why? Is it possible because he's never been serious about prayer? He's never really pursued the Lord. God's kindness and sovereignty has been all over his life, but Jacob has not responded in a way that would demonstrate relationship with the Lord. So what is prayer? Listen, prayer is communication for the sake of communion. Communication for the sake of communion. Question. I'm sure that most of you in the room, if you grew up in church, have heard this phrase, and it is a true phrase. Maybe you can help me complete it. Christianity is not about rules, it's about relationship. Every relationship that you have in your life requires communication. If there is no communication, there is no relationship. Is that fair? That relationship doesn't really exist if there is no communion with the person you want relationship with. So let me give you hope right now. No matter where you're at in your prayer life, no matter if it's good or if it's great, there's a lot of communication, there's very little communication. Hear this right now. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16. Let us as corporately, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Here's the thing. Prayer is a gift that God has given you. And if I can give you a one-word definition for prayer, I would say it this way: access. You have access to the God who sits on the throne. You have access to grace. You have access to mercy in your time of need. So the question is, do you access the throne of God? Why would we want to do that? Do you realize that God has opened the door for you to come to him at any point in your life, whenever you want? You can fall before him like Jacob is doing, where he's pleading with God for help. He needs grace. He needs mercy. He needs God to intervene in the situation for his family. Why would we do that? Here's the beautiful thing. Because our God is on the throne, and he's a God of infinite amount of resources. So that means this: if 1 million people all go to the throne room of God at the exact same time, they fall on their face and they ask God for the exact same thing, God will never run out of resources. He could say yes to all million, give them each the exact same thing they're all requesting, and never run out of that very thing. He's a God of infinite amount of resources. Here's the truth. Many of you, like me, have grown up in church your whole life. You know a lot about the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. You might even have a lot of Bible memory in your life. But if you don't pray, you don't have relationship. You don't have it. Why? Because you don't access the throne. God is saying the door's open. I'm sitting here waiting for you to come to me. Do you realize that God actually grants you grace, not because he needs you? He grants you opportunity to come to him and access this throne, the God of infinite resources, not because he needs you, but because you and I desperately need to hear from God. So guess what happens? The reason shame is so loud in our life is because we don't run to the throne of God so he can tell us who we are in him. We don't go, we don't access the throne, so all that we get to hear is Satan's arrows hitting our lives saying, listen, you're a joke. You're a loser. You destroy everything you touch in your life. If you access the throne, it's a game changer. Because God is going to tell you who you are, and you can come in there with all our shame. We can bow our head. We can have our shoulders shrugged, and he's inclined to hear. And in Psalm tells us he's the lifter of our faces. Like he bends over, he picks up your chin, and he speaks softly to you to tell you exactly who you are in him. I see you. I know what you're facing. You're fully seen, fully known, fully loved by me. I love how the beauty of prayer is to access the throne. Our God who reigns on the throne, who has infinite amount of resources, is an opportunity for us to pull heaven down to earth, right? I think the voice of shame is so loud in our life because we never take time to hear the voice of Jesus. And so Jacob's prayer here is actually a prayer of survival. So question, would a life or death situation want to give you courage to access God's throne, or the God who has infinite amount of resources, then would you actually want to go to God? If it's a life or death situation, oh, now I need the God who reigns on the throne, who has infinite amount of resources. Now I'll go into his throne. Here's the challenge that I've been thinking about this all week, and that is this. When prayer is your plan B, you will always choose plan A. When prayer is your plan B, you will always choose plan A. So guess what God does? God brings situations in our lives where plan A will do nothing for you, and we have to turn and fall on our face and choose plan B. I've experienced it more times in my life, and it's uncomfortable. Where God says, here's the thing, you accessing me is your only strategy that's gonna work right now. Stop with the nonsense. Stop playing games. Notice Jacob, what he says in verse 10. He says, I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of your steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. That's a crazy statement. He's saying this, I'm not worthy of your love. He's coming to God and saying, God, I'm not worthy of the access to you. I'm not worthy of you loving me. And he highlights all the faithfulness that God has given him in his life. It's almost as if Jacob realizes he's the worst person he knows. Crazy. Let's talk about Jacob for a minute. Think about all the ways that God has blessed Jacob in his life without Jacob ever asking God to do anything. We could talk about the first time he saw Rachel. It was like a love at first sight kind of thing. Eventually, after he was deceived, he got to marry Rachel. Every child that he has is because we read it, God opened and closed the wombs of his wife so he could actually have the children. God was heavily involved in that. Remember the one day where he made a deal with Laban to say, hey, I want to leave you, but I'd like to take my own herd with me, and so I'll take all the messed up sheep and I'll leave here. And he's like, that's fine. And he started putting sticks in water. Do you remember that? And what did God do? God multiplied the sheep like crazy. So when Jacob actually leaves, he has ridiculous amounts of wealth. He actually showed up in supernatural ways there. You see, God's hands have been all over Jacob's life. And so maybe the question that we need to ask for Jacob and the question that we need to ask for ourselves is this. If God has blessed us all in ridiculous ways without us even asking him, what would God actually do when we access the throne? And ask God, we need help. God, I need grace. God, I need mercy again. Let us corporately draw near to the throne of grace. It's a throne of grace. It's not a throne of judgment, something the verse says. It's certainly not a throne of shame. So if you want hope, this is the only place to actually turn. It's an incredible picture for us to be challenged by that. So what happens in the text? In verse 11 and 12, in his prayer, he says, please deliver me from the hand of my brother, the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me and the mothers and the children. What a crazy statement. This is, again, is a prayer of survival. Here's what Jacob is saying. God, if you don't do something, I am going to die. My wives are going to die. My children are going to die. Now, here's the crazy part. The next person to actually attack him is not going to be Esau. It's going to be God. But Jacob is more afraid, I think, of Esau than he actually is the Lord. So God is using this tension to actually wake Jacob up, spiritually speaking, right, to what he wants to do in his heart and in his life. And so when you are ready to declare that you cannot control the outcome anymore, know this, that God is just waiting for you to meet him in the throne room. He's waiting, friends. Question, what is more important to you than Jesus? Because I think we have some confession to make. Because your marriage can't be more important. Your kids can't be more important. Your kids' sports can't be more important. Your vacations can't be more important. Your job can't be more important. Listen, you tell me about the rhythm of your prayer, and I will tell you how important Jesus really is to you. You see, we learn through Jacob that we love to control. But here's the crazy part. Our prayer life, if we surrender to him, what is it? It's waving the white flag, saying, God, this is where we actually need to be. But if our lack of prayer life exists, like we don't pray at all, that means this. We're living a life of scheming, trying to work everything out in our life for our own good. Maybe you've heard the phrase before, be the buffalo. Now, when I say that phrase, I'm not referencing Justin Kemmer's Buffalo Bills, if you've been around our church, okay? That's not what I'm actually referencing. The phrase, be the buffalo, is a reference to how cows and buffalo handle storms. You see, when a storm comes on the scene, guess what a cow does? A cow can sense that, and then a cow wants to run. It wants to create the greatest amount of distance between the storm and them. It wants to avoid the storm at all costs. But the truth is, that's actually not how buffaloes respond to storms. When buffaloes sense a storm, what they do is they turn and face the storm, and they want to run right into it because they know the fastest way through the storm is to actually get into the storm and then run through the storm. You see, all the anxiety they're going to experience, the distress they're going to experience, the tribulation because of that storm, it's a shorter period if you go through it and you actually endure it. And I feel like it's like, hey, Jacob, be the buffalo. Go face your brother is what I actually want to tell him. Why? Because God has said this, Jacob, I'm actually with you. It's time to face your past, and you can either run from it, Jacob, or you can run into it. Jacob, get prayed up and run into it. So what does Jacob choose? Look at verse 13 with me. Plan A or plan B? So he stayed there that night in verse 13, and from that he had with him, he took a present for his brother Esau. 200 female goats, 20 male goats, all these different animals, all right? Tons of them, all right? Look at verse 16. These he handed over to his servants. Every drove by itself and said to his servants, pass on ahead of me. Put a space between drove and drove. He instructed the first, when Esau, my brother, meets you and asks you, to whom do you belong? Where are you going? And whose are these ahead of you? You shall say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are present, sent to my lord Esau. And moreover, he is behind us. He likewise instructed the second and the third and all who followed the droves. You shall say the same thing to Esau when you find him. And you shall say, moreover, your servant Jacob's behind us. For he thought, I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me. And afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So the present passed on ahead of him, and he himself stayed that night in the camp. What does Jacob choose? Plan A or plan B? By the way, let me be honest. I see my life in Jacob. Do you? I mean, so often I'm scheming, and then there's seasons where I'm praying, and then I leave the throne room for some reason, which is just a dumb idea, and I start scheming again and try to control outcomes. You ever find this cycle in your life? It seems to me that Jacob has to decide, do I need to take control, or do I trust that God actually has control? And based on some of the phrases, it seems to me that he's actually scheming again. Look at verse 20. Look at the phrase again in verse 20. It says that he says, for he thought that I might appease him with the present. So he's trying to scheme to get an outcome that it actually wants in his life. And I would argue that his past has a really loud voice in his life. And so maybe you've experienced the crippling effects of shame before. But 3 times in this text, Jacob mentions presents. He wants to give Esau presents. Verse 13, verse 18, verse 21, he mentions presents. And what does he say? Perhaps he will accept me. And so what does he do? He arranges 550 animals in a parade. And he has all these animals divided in sections, and in between each section is a servant. And so his plan is, I'm gonna have all the animals, the gifts, the presents, march towards Esau. He'll get to see them all, and then the servant will say, they belong to your brother Jacob, and they're a present for my lord Esau, is what the servant says. And then the next part of the parade, the next crew of animals come. Servant says the same thing. Then the next part of the animals come. 550 animals he's going to give his brother. This is what you give to kings, not enemies. It's an awesome plan. A beautiful parade. Ever been to a parade of animals? I haven't. Be interesting. We do see this, though. For the first time in Jacob's life, he wants to be last. But we know that Jacob wants to do whatever he can to appease and be accepted by Esau. And so our gospel takeaway this morning is this: when Jesus speaks, shame is silenced. When Jesus speaks, shame is silenced. Here's the beautiful thing. Jesus actually rewrites our story by speaking louder than our past. And I want you to hear me that until the voice of Jesus is louder than the voice of shame, you're never going to get out of the prison of condemnation. It's always going to be louder. And so what needs to change, right, for you to actually hear the voice of Jesus more? Well, maybe it's prayer. Maybe it's accessing the throne of God, the God of infinite amounts of resources. When we study the Bible, there are different pictures of shame in the Bible. We can mention three: a nakedness, uncleanliness, and defilement. And what's the goal then of shame? The goal is to create for you to be an outcast, for you to believe that you're a loser, that no one wants you, that no one desires you. That's the goal. Here's the good news of Jesus, though. The good news is that Jesus actually became our nakedness, our uncleanliness, and our defilement. And he was the very one who was treated as an outcast. And what is the result of that? The result is this, is that Jesus cleanses you from your sin. Think about this. There is no condemnation for you. He loves you deeply. He wants relationship with you. He cares for you. He wants you to come to him. He's not trying to get rid of you. He's trying to get you close. He cleanses you from your sin. What else does he do? He clothes you in righteousness, that you stand before God just as if you've never sinned and just as if you've always perfectly obeyed. Do you understand? That's nonsense, right? He declares that you are his own. So we no longer run from him, but we run to him. And so question, are you ready to run to the throne room yet? Are you ready to pursue the Lord with whatever you came in this morning with infinite amounts of resources? Why are we so slow to go to him? And so I just want to give us a moment in our seat to access the throne. Just between you and the Lord. Go to him in prayer. What is heavy on you? Where's the guilt and shame louder in your life than the voice of Jesus? And I just want to give you a moment to go before him and own that and know this: he's a lifter of your face. And he wants to meet you. So let's take a moment and run to the Lord through prayer.